A warning to Donald Trump not to cancel a landmark climate change agreement. As nearly 200 countries finalise the details, an appeal to keep America signed up.
No one has a right to make decisions that affect billions of people based on solely ideology or without proper input.
But during his campaign, Donald Trump pledged to pull out of the deal, calling climate change a hoax. And the president-elect keeps the world guessing about his new government, giving the press the slip to enjoy a night out at a local restaurant. Also tonight, the Croydon Tram Crash. A report finds it was travelling over 3 times the speed limit. The last words of MP Jo Cox urging her staff to run and save themselves. Off message, we see how China silences an independent candidate standing for election. And flat pack housing, why the government thinks it could help solve the housing crisis.
Here in the south, out with a bang, ferries and trains cancelled and parts of Portsmouth sealed off after a World War II bomb is discovered. And 20 years after Vera Holland's murder, her family's plea to help solve the case.
Good evening. The US Secretary of State, John Kerry, has made a direct appeal to all countries, including his own, to press ahead with the fight against climate change, saying a failure to do so would be a betrayal of devastating consequences. President-elect Donald Trump has pledged to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement to limit global warming, calling climate change a hoax perpetrated by China. But Mr. Kerry, speaking at UN climate talks in Morocco, said he believed his government's commitment would be kept. From Marrakesh, here's our science editor, David Shipman.
Morocco is proudly hosting this year's talks on climate change, but the very future of the process is suddenly in doubt. Because of someone who isn't even here, the next American president, Donald Trump, who's dismissed every aspect of global warming. For the US Secretary of State, John Kerry, who worked for years towards the Paris Climate Agreement, these are difficult times, and he was unusually blunt about the dangers.
No one has a right to make decisions that affect billions of people based on solely ideology or without proper input. Anyone who has these conversations, who takes the time to learn from these experts, who gets the full picture of what we're facing, I believe they can only come to one legitimate decision, and that is to act boldly on climate change and encourage others to do the same.
Donald Trump once called global warming a hoax. In a tweet 4 years ago, he claimed it had been invented by the Chinese to undermine American industry. And in the campaign, he was emphatic about what he'd do.
We're going to cancel the Paris Climate Agreement and stop all payments of the United States tax dollars to UN global warming programs.
That's rung alarm bells among island nations most vulnerable to the worst of global warming, and they're pleading for a change of heart.
President-elect Trump, I formally invite you to Fiji and promise you the warmest of welcomes. We will show you how we are already having to move entire communities out of the way of the rising seas.
This comes as the overwhelming conclusion of climate science is that oil and other fossil fuels are driving global warming and need to be cut back. That coal in particular is too dirty to be burned. But Mr. Trump has pledged to revive America's struggling coal mines.
We're going to save the coal industry. We're going to save that coal industry. Believe me, we're going to save it. I love those people. These are great people.
The big puzzle for everybody here is what exactly Donald Trump will do when he reaches office. In the last few days, he's rode back on several campaign promises. So will he do the same with climate change? Or will he do something that no American president has done before him? Take the United States entirely out of this process. This has unnerved some of the world's biggest companies. So today they called on Mr. Trump to stick with the Paris Agreement.
There is concern that any effort that could be made to undermine U.S. ongoing engagement through the Paris Agreement and beyond, and staying the course on clean energy policy creates significant concern on these issues.
So where could this lead? Well, in cities gripped by smog, such as Delhi recently, there's pressure to turn to cleaner sources of power, whatever Mr. Trump does. And renewable energy is tumbling in price, with the spread of vast solar plants like this in America, a trend that's set to continue regardless of what the next president decides. David Shukman, BBC News in Marrakesh.
Meanwhile, in New York, Donald Trump is also keeping the world guessing about who will form his team in government. Despite numerous tweets from the man himself and rumours of bitter infighting, little is known so far about who will be his key appointments. And the president-elect opted to give the press the slip and pop out to a local restaurant for a family dinner. Our North America editor, John Sopel, reports.
There won't be many more evenings like this. Donald Trump giving reporters the slip and heading out into the New York night to have dinner.
Thank you. Have a good meal. Thank you.
From January, more or less his every move will be a matter of public record. But it was probably a welcome relief from the grind of the transition. His campaign manager rejecting suggestions that the transition was in chaos. So when would there be new appointments announced?
I'm not sure it'll be today, but it'll be soon. It's just a lot to digest, and putting together a federal government is a big task.
But others have described the jockeying for position as like a knife fight in Trump Tower, as potential recruits wait to get the nod from the president-elect. The former mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, has made clear he wants to be Secretary of State, America's top diplomat. But his previous commercial work with foreign governments might bring conflict of interest charges. Or how about John Bolton, the Bush-era UN ambassador? He's a defence hawk, but how will that sit with Donald Trump's more isolationist tendencies? And will there be a job for former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin? She could become one of the leading women in Trump's cabinet and is said to be a contender for Secretary of the Interior. Another of those being tipped for high office is the former Speaker, Newt Gingrich.
The beginning of any transition like this has turmoil because it's just the nature of the process. And I think that Trump is very decisive. He's a very good CEO. And I think what you're seeing will become clear over the next 2 or 3 weeks as they build out the cabinet and figure out specific things.
As ever with Mr. Trump, if you want to find out what's going on inside his head, the best place to find out is his Twitter account. He's furious at media reports that the transition is in turmoil. He wrote these at 6 this morning. The failing New York Times story is so totally wrong on transition. It's going so smoothly. Also, I've spoken to many foreign leaders. And then this. I've received and taken calls from many foreign leaders, despite what the failing New York Times said. Russia, UK, China, Saudi Arabia, Japan. But the tenants in this New York building have decided to transition out of the Trump era.
People brand us and like, oh, you live in Trump. Does that mean you support him? I'm like, no, it doesn't mean that.
In some symbolic way, it's being shown he doesn't own our home and maybe never can really own our home.
They voted to have the big gold letters removed from the apartment block that bears his name. Bringing the nation together and binding its wounds is going to be a long process. So 200 million people in America are waiting to find out who will be part of the government. 200 nations around the world waiting to hear what Donald Trump will do about climate change. There's an extent to which any transition process is always chaotic. They have been in the past, they will be in the future. But there is something so unorthodox about Donald Trump. The campaign, the transition process. He fired the person who was meant to be heading it at the end of last week. Other people have gone. Apparently he wants his son-in-law to have the highest possible security clearance. That's unorthodox too. But the Vice President, Joe Biden, today met with his successor. Joe Biden was asked, will the Trump administration be ready on day one? To which Mr. Biden replied, no administration is ever ready on day one. We weren't either. I think for that response, Joe Biden might just have earned himself a place on Donald Trump's Christmas card list. Fiona.
John Sopel in Washington, thank you. A preliminary report into last week's tram crash in Croydon has found that it was travelling at 3.5 times the speed limit for the section of track where it derailed. 7 people died and 50 were injured. The driver is on bail after being arrested on suspicion of manslaughter. Emma Simpson has more.
7 lives lost. They were all on an everyday journey to work, which ended in tragedy. Bob Huxley, aged 63, was among them. Today, his brother-in-law Tony came back to the scene, where there was a whole corner devoted to Bob.
I don't think it's sank in with half the family yet, to be honest. It's so hard to believe you can just get up in the morning to go to work. It's all he's ever done all his life, and then you just don't come back.
The tram derailed on a sharp bend before tipping on its side, travelling 25 metres before stopping. Rail accident investigators are now building a picture of what happened. The speed limit was 12.5 miles per hour at the corner. Initial findings show it was going at 43.5 miles per hour, more than 3 times as fast. There were no obstructions on the track, and there were no mechanical defects, including the brakes. The driver applied them, but it wasn't sufficient to slow it down enough before the bend.
I've been in pain, my shoulder, my elbow.
Taye Ajibola was on the tram. He was back in hospital for a checkup today, where he told me he wasn't surprised at today's findings. He could feel it was going to crash.
To avoid the accident, they should reduce the speed whenever they're speeding, and they should know that, oh, we passengers on the carriage. So to avoid this accident, they should reduce it, so this accident will not happen again. Without that, our life is at risk.
Extra speed restrictions are now being put in place on this stretch of the route.
It was clear from the outset that the tram had been going too fast around that bend. The key question remains why, and that will take a lot longer to establish. There are now 3 separate investigations.
Today they were testing the tracks as they prepare to finally reopen this line. The driver, meanwhile, remains on police bail. The pain here is still raw as investigators now broaden their inquiry. Emma Simpson, BBC News, Croydon.
In Syria, at least 21 people have died during a second day of airstrikes against rebel-held areas in the east of Aleppo. One of the city's last remaining medical facilities, a children's hospital, was damaged. Staff and patients were forced to take shelter in the hospital's basement. An Italian government minister has described Boris Johnson's Brexit strategy as insulting when he suggested Italy should back a good deal for the UK so as not to lose out on sales of Prosecco. Here, the government's plans for Brexit have been described as a total shambles by Labour and the SNP. Our political editor, Laura Koonsberg, has more.
Champagne or Prosecco, as long as it's cold. Our Foreign Secretary is not being toasted by Europe's ministers this week. Sitting down with the Italians, Boris Johnson apparently demanded that the UK wants free trade and a stop to free movement of people. Impossible in many EU minds. Insulting in the Italians, especially when the Foreign Secretary said their exports of the fizzy stuff might be at risk. Mr. Johnson said,
You will allow us to do this because you don't want to lose, Prosecco export. And I said, yeah, maybe this is, we're going to lose some Prosecco, you're going to lose some fish and chips export. The difference is that I'm going to lose toward one country, you toward 27.
Mr. Jeremy Corbyn!
The Foreign Secretary's adventures haven't been lost on Labour.
Yesterday, the Foreign Secretary told European media...
His claim yesterday that we'd probably have to leave the customs union, when she's trying so hard to give nothing away.
We're preparing carefully for the formal negotiations. What we want to ensure is that we have the best possible trading deal with the European Union once we have left.
Jeremy Corbyn! The Foreign Secretary has been very helpful on this week, because he informed the world that Brexit means Brexit. We didn't know that before. And that beyond that, we're going to make a titanic success of it.
A rare red face. The Foreign Office told us there was no intention to insult the Italians. But his hosts in Prague might have been surprised to hear his verdict on their view that we can't have no free movement and keep free trade.
It's nonsense to say it's bollocks. You can translate bollocks into check.
And the German Foreign Secretary's verdict on Mr. Johnson 10 days ago? I am not amused.
I think that Boris needs to learn a bit of gravitas. I think that the job of Foreign Secretary is a serious job, and you shouldn't be going around insulting other countries.
Diplomats are meant to be, well, diplomatic. But frankly, it was more surprising that Boris Johnson became Foreign Secretary than the fact that he is now raising an eyebrow or two. And there is a wider frustration in some parts of government at just how quiet on the EU Number 10 wants to be. And while there's silence from them, others will fill it.
This is the more formal version of how it's done. But sometimes the worst thing in politics is to be ignored. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
The last words of the MP Jo Cox as she lay dying after being stabbed and shot have been heard at the Old Bailey. Her mother and sister listened in tears as one of her colleagues described how she urged her staff to run and save themselves. Thomas Mayer, who's 53, denies murdering Jo Cox in June. Daniela Relf was at the Old Bailey.
The family of Jo Cox today heard the harrowing details of the attack on the MP and emotional accounts from those who tried to comfort her. They also saw extensive CCTV footage plotting the movements of Thomas Mayer around Birstall on the day of the attack. Fasila Aswat was Jo Cox's office manager. She told the jury that they were friends as well as colleagues. The court was shown CCTV footage of her driving Jo Cox to Birstall Library in this silver car. And she was at her side as the attack on the MP began just minutes later. Fasila Aswat explained how she suddenly saw Jo Cox on the floor and that a man was stood over her with a knife. She said she screamed out for help as panic set in. She even tried to fight him off with her handbag, but couldn't stop him. She heard him shout, "Britain first, and this is for Britain." She described telling Jo Cox to think of her children and that she needed to run, but it was too late. Jo Cox replied, "I can't run, I'm hurt." Fasila Aswat was calm and composed as she told the court she held Jo Cox in her arms after the attack. She said that day, in an instant, their lives were changed forever. Another colleague was with them that day. Sandra Major told the jury how Jo Cox even tried to protect her staff as she was being stabbed. She described how the MP told them, get away, you two. Let him hurt me, don't let them hurt you." Further CCTV showed the moments after the attack. The prosecution claim this is Thomas Mayer walking from the scene. Metres away, Jo Cox was fighting for her life. Earlier, the court had heard about the arrest of Thomas Mayer from the police officers who apprehended him. Mobile phone footage showed him being rugby tackled to the ground. As he was arrested, the police officers said he told them, "It's me, I'm a political activist." Daniela Relf, BBC News, the Old Bailey.
In Iraq, special forces are slowly pushing back so-called Islamic State in the country's second city, Mosul. But the fighting is hard, with IS using snipers and car bombs. As they push forward, Iraqi forces are gathering valuable intelligence about IS, its foreign fighters and its international network. Our Middle East correspondent Quentin Somerville and cameraman Nick Millard joined a patrol of special forces and sent this report.
Iraqi special forces are on a manhunt. Even in the midst of battle, small actions can make a big difference. They're searching house to house for any trace of fighters from the so-called Islamic State. They've received a tip-off that some lived in this street. They're not looking for weapons, but for something more valuable: names, numbers, and raw intelligence.
The fighters came into Al Zuhur district. Lots of foreign fighters, Russians, Chinese, Tunisians.
This flag belonged to an Australian, an IS fighter and medic. He's fled. For the past 2 years, this was the Islamic State's city. It was mostly cut off from the outside world. Now the barriers are coming down, and it's clear IS had one priority during its occupation: preparing for this war. In every neighbourhood, IS fighters made themselves at home. Freshly abandoned, this is where IS made its own drones. It seems the Islamic State only just left this drone factory a couple of days ago. They were taking shop-bought drones, modifying them and turning them into weapons. Amid the grenades and fuses, an important discovery. Written in English, costs and timetables for drone manufacture.
We fight against international terrorism, and we should look for this information, and we share this information with our other units and also with other countries.
Schools, homes, all can be IS gun positions. There's a sniper at the end of this street. He's fired off 3 shots, so very carefully the men are leaving this building one by one and getting into the vehicles as quickly as possible. We make it across unharmed, and so do all of the special forces. Except one. Gunner Hussein takes a shot to the back. Patched up on the scene, he's walking wounded, and he's going to make it. Though determined, the Islamic State is losing its grip. With every street taken, the greater the losses and more intelligence is discovered. So here and far beyond Iraq, the Islamic State is being diminished. Quentin Somerville, BBC News, Mosul.
The number of people unemployed in the UK has fallen to 1.6 million, its lowest in 11 years. The figures come from the Office for National Statistics. Our economics correspondent Andy Verity is at a printing firm in East London. Andy, there were many voices warning that unemployment would rise if we voted for Brexit, so why the drop?
Well, the short answer, Fiona, is the economy kept on growing against those gloomy expectations. It's kept on adding jobs. This company here in East London is an example, actually. It's a high-spec printing works which does brochures for the likes of Sotheby's, the auction house, or the big banks. Now, they had a very short pause after the referendum where they had no orders at all, and there was a bit of a panic, but very soon the whole thing started up again. And as you can hear and see, the printers are running at full tilt behind me at this time of night. Just like the economy, it's humming. And look at the unemployment rate, if you want proof of that. It got down to 4.8%. Now, that's a very low rate of unemployment, the lowest we've seen since 2005. Why has it got that low? Well, again, the economy has been growing, but as a proportion, a percentage of the workforce, it's low also because the workforce is bigger than it's ever been, some 32 million people, and it's added 461,000 people to the workforce in the year to September. We know something about who those people are. More than half of them come from the rest of the European Union. But if you look at those born in the UK, just about 36,000 of those extra jobs were for people born in the UK. So it's a rosy picture generally, with some qualifications. The number of people claiming unemployment-related benefits has ticked up and the jobs growth has slowed a little bit. But on the whole, no doubt it's a good headline.
Andy Verity in East London, thank you. While the world continues to digest the result of the US election, China is holding its own national ballot, one of the biggest anywhere. Over the next few months, up to 900 million people will vote in China's district elections. But while the Communist Party has been highly critical of what it sees as the farce of American democracy, as John Sudworth has been finding out in Beijing, it's not so keen on scrutiny of its own system.
We've turned up, as agreed, for an interview, but we find our way to the front door blocked.
Can you explain what you're doing?
By a group of men. The person who lives here is doing something that's very brave in China, trying to stand for election as an independent candidate.
Mr. Liu, hello. So we're hoping we can come in and talk to you.
Yes, she answers, come in.
Thank you. Excuse me, I think we have permission to go in and speak to this lady.
But it's no use. It's my right to stand for election, she begins to tell me. She tries again. Why won't you let me open my door, she asks. China often uses sinister, unidentified men to do its sensitive police work, and there are few issues more sensitive here than democracy. Every 5 years, hundreds of millions of Chinese people get their only chance to vote. The district elections are, in theory, open to any candidate. In reality, the Communist Party decides who's on the ballot. And the Communist Party-run media has this year been handed a gift. The US election has been exploited to the full, as proof of American weakness and division and Chinese stability and strength.
We have permission.
But China, of course, has its share of discord and dissent.
So China has made huge capital out of what it sees as the farce and the circus of the US election, the huge effort and expense that goes into an artificial choice. But what we can see here quite clearly is the huge effort and expense that China puts in to stopping people exercising their democratic rights.
All this for one independent local election candidate.
You're going to break my coat. Let go. Let go.
We're dragged away, but the heavy-handed control is as much a sign of insecurity as it is of strength. John Sudworth, BBC News, Beijing.
Now, many of us would struggle with a flat-pack wardrobe, so imagine constructing a flat-pack house. But the government believes that so-called modular homes, assembled in a factory and then put up quickly on site, may be key in helping solve the housing crisis. It's set up a fund worth millions to try to kickstart the idea. For our latest report into housing in the UK, our home editor Mark Easton has been to Manchester.
When people buy a new house in Britain, the choice is usually limited to take it or leave it. But in some places, the relationship between home buyer and builder is being reconstructed. Modular houses, homes made in a factory, offer bespoke rather than off the peg. You can choose how many stories, how many rooms, and even where the walls go. Not only do contemporary modular homes like these in Manchester threaten to change the way we buy houses, the government also hopes they'll inspire many more people to build houses. People like Tom Bloxham.
The way we build houses conventionally is actually feudal, reliant on itinerant labour moving from site to site. Things built in factories are better quality, better made, better tolerances. And actually, why not build homes in factories like we build cars, like we build everything else?
At the moment, modular homes are actually no cheaper than conventional new housing. But the government believes that if production can be substantially increased, economies of scale will kick in. Prices will fall and overall housing supply will rise. The Manchester houses were built 70 miles away here in Derbyshire. New factories are coming on stream, but for the moment, this kind of construction is still a niche market, and there are calls for government to step in to stimulate the new industry.
Helping companies like mine link up with local authorities and release land for which can be built upon, and then secondly, helping on the demand side by helping us make contact and form relationships with housing associations and registered social providers.
Britain's first factory-made show house, prototype of the $500,000 promised by Mr. Churchill.
Britain's relationship with modular building is coloured by the post-war prefab. Available only in Magnolia and with a planned life of 10 years, the legacy of the prefab is that we still tend to associate factory-built homes with austerity, drafts and damp.
I consider the kitchen, with a built-in refrigerator and such other useful equipments, a great advance in a working man's home.
The elevator bedroom and sunken lounge with flip-up diner.
But now, a new breed of British entrepreneur is looking at making modular living aspirational.
It's simple, it's magical, and I think it's the way we'll all live in the future.
I think we could see that. You know, we see how people desire other things. We see how people desire cars and particular models of phones and all of those kinds of things.
Could be the same with houses, really?
I think so, yeah.
Factory-built houses currently make up less than 1% of supply, but can ministers rehabilitate the prefab? There's talk of 100,000 by 2020, but it'll take political will to have affordable homes delivered to our doorstep. Mark Easton, BBC News, Manchester.
That's it from us here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Bye-bye.